Welcome back to Harbour Unboxed for part 3 of this month's Q&A series. And yes, I'm sort of losing my voice. This time of year I get really bad hay fever. My throat's quite dry, so that's why my voice sounds weird. So no need to worry, I'm not getting sick or I'm not sick or anything like that. But I appreciate the concern for those of you that would have put something down in the comment section below.
And you know they would have.
Yes. Okay, so part 3 Q&A, Patreon/float playing questions. Not much more else to say than that, other than thanks to everyone who supports us directly on those various services. And I think we'll probably just go answer your questions now before my voice runs out.
Let's get into it. All right, first question. Some of the retailers here in the UK and elsewhere in the EU have stated that they do not expect any more reference cards to be made available after the initial day zero supply of reference RX 6800 and XT models. Would you consider this to be further evidence that the AMD stated MSRP price was misleading to customers, as now the only options are the higher priced AIB cards?
Well, okay, so first of all, the reference cards getting phased out quite quickly isn't uncommon. So that doesn't really raise alarm bells with me.
No.
So what does, obviously, is the stupidly overpriced AIB cards that we've already spoke about at length in part 1 of the Q&A series, so we probably won't rehash too much of that. But I'll just reiterate that AMD, over the phone, in a conversation that Tim and I had with them, that in 4 to 8 weeks, we will have MSRP AIB cards. So that's, in our opinion, that's not really good enough. Those cards should have been listed already. Even if they're out of stock, at least knowing that they're there, because we can sort of hold them to that, I suppose. Once they're listed, they're listed. If the price goes up after availability improves, then that's not a good look. So yeah, we basically have to wait at this point and see what happens. But yeah, probably not too much more to say on that we haven't already said.
It's certainly misleading in the short term, in that if you're buying a GPU right now and you're very lucky and you can actually find one in stock, that you have to pay these just insane prices. So it's definitely misleading from that front. But long term, probably is still going to be MSRP, at least we hope.
Yeah, look, as I said on the live stream, if in 4 to, let's say, maybe give them as much as 6 weeks, if in 4 to 6 weeks from now, the AIB cards are at the MSRP and availability is not terrible, then I think a lot of this will blow over and this will end up still being an AMD win. I think that's kind of our take on it. But if if Nvidia get their supply into gear, then that's going to really compound the issue for AMD, and they're going to find themselves in an awkward position, I would say.
Yep.
For the latest video containing, so this would be my power color video, so I probably should lead with that. So this question, I think, is aimed at the power color Red Devil review, where I spent a good portion of that video talking about pricing and availability. So in that video, talking about all those pricing issues, have you had many AIBs reach out to you displeased about the position they're in, being that many of the accusations were aimed at them, especially now that the video has been published? So the video went up last night. I pretty much went to bed shortly after to get some actual sleep for today, because I am, as I said, struggling with hay fever a bit this time of year. And I got in the car when I woke up and came to Tim's house. So I haven't really even looked at my emails, so I have no idea. I had a few phone calls on the way here, potentially regarding that, but didn't really have time to talk about it all. Yeah, so I don't think AIBs would say anything to me that they haven't already said leading up to the reviews. Obviously, they were all very tight-lipped about the price because they saw this. What's the word for the SHIT storm? They saw this situation coming. Are they displeased about it? Well, they're telling us that margins are at an all-time low. So if that's true, and we are taking them at their word on that, then it would mean that their margins are low and their prices are ridiculously high, which is not good. So they're sort of taking a brand image hit while making less margin, which is obviously something they don't want to do. So I think if that's true, they would be displeased. And it would mean that AMD is making a much larger margin. Whether that's true, we don't know. It's either the AIBs or AMD who is responsible for these heavily inflated prices. And as far as we're concerned, AMD gets the blame regardless, because they're responsible for it and they've created this situation.
Yeah, it's really a situation, I think we talked about this in the live stream, where both sides are sort of passing the blame onto anyone but themselves as much as they possibly can.
Yeah, well, no one wants to be like, hey, I'm ripping you all off.
Yeah, so, yeah, no one's going to come out and just admit it. I think based on AIBs revealing more information around this launch than previously they would be willing to, says to me that they probably are not very happy about being blamed for some of these things. Whether or not it is still their fault is another question entirely, because no one likes being blamed for anything, even if they are at fault. So, yeah, there's just so much going on with these launches. There's so much going on that's not great. And yeah, I can't imagine AIBs are really super happy about pricing their GPUs and ripping people off, unless they're making a nice tidy buck on the side. So, yeah, who knows?
All right, a question regarding the most recent GPU series. Ignoring the lack of stock and availability issues, so we can finally stop talking about this for this one, it sounds like. What do you feel about these most recent GPUs, and how do you feel about there once again being two brands at play at the top? So basically, how do we feel about the return to competition? Well, I don't want to talk about stock and availability again, but it's extremely exciting. It's great news. It's awesome. It's something we haven't seen in a very, very long time. Top-down competition, when was the last time we saw it? Has it happened since you've been in this industry?
Right at the start, I mean, I wasn't really covering GPUs as much, but R9 200 series?
Yeah. Yep.
Was back then, so 2013?
Yep. They still...
So probably 6 or 7 years.
Yeah. Yep. It's been a while.
The 300 series was also reasonably competitive, but it was kind of just a refresh.
They were sort of getting left behind at that point.
Yeah. And then just got worse and worse and worse.
From there, yeah.
So, yeah.
So, yeah, look, it's really exciting. It's really positive stuff. It's all that good stuff. Unfortunately, it's been undermined and undone by the stock availability and pricing.
Yeah. I mean, the products, it's frustrating, and I'm sure it's frustrating for the companies as well, but it's frustrating that so much of the discussion around this launch has been about pricing and availability, as opposed to what's actually very compelling, high quality, great performing GPUs. I mean, these GPUs are a lot faster than previous generation cards, like significantly faster, and no one's talking about that anymore. It's all talk about, I can't get them, pricing, blah, 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 and that's really overshadowed it, which is disappointing, because really this has been the best GPU launch, pricing and availability aside, since 2013, 2012, before that, HD 7000 series, like that sort of era.
That's where I was thinking.
So we're talking very, very long time. As you say, almost the entire time I've been doing this.
Back when mid-range single slot cards were a thing.
Yeah, crazy times.
All right, how come Nvidia hasn't dropped prices on the 2080 Ti yet? It might make the pill easier to swallow for the lack of 3070 availability. Let's word it slightly different there. If there was a run-out alternative. So basically the reason they haven't is because of that reason.
Yeah.
Like, it's a supply and demand issue. If the 3070s had flooded the market, there was heaps of them, you could buy one easily, so basically supply exceeded demand, then the 2080 Ti would absolutely get discounted very heavily. But that hasn't happened. So it's like...
there's no incentive for them to drop the price yet. If the 2080 Ti is the only card at that performance level that you can buy on the market, then they're going to try and sell it at that price for as long as they possibly can.
People are already paying way more than what 3070s are worth, or should be worth.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, I think we spoke about this just earlier. It's a situation where you get screwed at all levels, basically. You get screwed on the current generation. The previous generation hasn't seen any kind of discount, which it should have. And then the used market is heavily inflated as well. It's very similar to what we saw during cryptocurrency.
All right, we've got serial question asker Nick, who I think manages to get a question in every single one of these Q&As. Always ask some good stuff,
Getting his money's worth.
According to the rumor mill, there's a 3080 Ti coming in January that is a cut down version, I guess, from the 3090, but still with more CUDA cores than the 3080. How do you think this will impact 3080 supply when the GA102 die supply has to be split among 3 cards instead of 2? Yeah, wouldn't be a good situation. I think they're going to have to... It wouldn't make sense to launch that card while they cannot ship 3090s or 3080s. It just... I mean, it just makes no sense. But once those products start becoming more available, then, as we always see, binning these dies into different price categories and tiers allows them to get more margin on the dies. Because if something's not quite good enough for a 3090 but is too good for a 3080, then right now that just has to be a 3080. And I guess probably they should be prioritizing getting those cards out. But if they could sell that as a 3080 Ti instead, then they can make a bit more money, which is obviously beneficial to them. So yeah, it's really hard to say whether it's a good or bad thing come January, because I don't expect people would be too happy if Nvidia started selling an even more expensive card while like day one orders are still not being shipped on a 3080.
Yeah, I mean, they're still going to be launching new cards anyway, so
I guess different dies and different things are going to be coming out, different sizes and all that sort of thing.
Yep.
So yeah, I guess from one perspective they just have to push ahead in some regards, and other perspectives have to be very mindful of these sort of things. So yeah, we'll see what happens on that one.
Definitely.
Next question. Is there any validity to Optimum Tech's observation that Nvidia cards have slightly more punchy contrast and color saturation than AMD when compared side by side in the same game? This is a very curious difference to me that I have not seen mentioned in any other 6000 series reviews.
Well, I'd say Ali's pretty trustworthy. A little surprising to me because it has been historically the other way around. So normally Radeon GPUs a bit more, more color saturation and stuff like that. I think people started noticing that, and so Nvidia had more of a neutral color palette, and I think people preferred the look of the more saturated, vivid colors that AMD were putting out, and they sort of attributed that to AMD having a better image quality. So I think Nvidia changed their color profiles to go more that way. So maybe that's what we're seeing with the latest generations, and I'm not sure if AMD has tweaked theirs. But basically, they don't have the same color profiles. So you will get slightly different colors if you use an AMD or an Nvidia GPU in games. That has no impact on performance. So you can actually go into the control panel and change those values to go more neutral or more saturated or whatever it is that you prefer the look of. And that has no impact on performance. So that's pretty much what we're looking at there.
Yeah, I think most of these things, it's not like the GPU is doing a different calculation. It's doing the same thing and then other stuff's happening on the side. And generally speaking, I know you're sort of saying that it's done a different way on purpose. In my opinion, almost all of these things are actually a misconfiguration. Sure. And they absolutely should be doing the same thing.
Okay.
So from what I can tell, most testing monitors and stuff, AMD and Nvidia GPUs, generally speaking, if they're configured the same on the same monitor, will produce the exact same image for desktop stuff.
Yeah.
Games can be slightly different because there's all sorts of stuff going on there. And yes, people have done side-by-side comparisons. Some of the things I've seen in the past where there was a particularly bad difference between AMD and Nvidia was that often some people would have the Nvidia GPUs color range configured incorrectly. So AMD would be using a full range, like 0 to 255.
Okay.
And Nvidia would be using like a 16 to 235, which wasn't being expanded up to the full range correctly. And that's often just a monitor GPU mismatch type issue, which usually that's done automatically and just doesn't happen for some reason. So historically that's been the case. But yeah, as you say, there are color sliders and stuff within the control panels, and those are going to give you slightly different things overall. But you should be able to configure both to look the same. So
you definitely can,
yeah, it's not like they're rendering like a texture, a completely different color, and then you're getting like a worse image on Nvidia or AMD. You can mess around with that stuff and get it the way that you want it to look.
You showed in your 3080 review that Ampere is quite bottlenecked architecturally at resolutions below 4K, with this showing up as wins for the 6800 XT at 1080p and 1440p. Since 4K is typically more memory heavy, do you think that the rumoured 20GB card makes sense, or that Nvidia's upcoming bar implementation could work in a similar way to having more memory? Okay, so two sort of completely different things there. So you are correct that it's bottlenecked architecturally, or the architecture doesn't scale as well because...
Ooh, controversial opinion, because some people think it's a CPU bottleneck, but I think we've shown that
they're
it's
definitely
not.
wrong. They're definitely wrong. It's the FP32, the way they've changed the way that works. So it's very clear that the 3080 relative to... keep AMD out of it for a moment.
Yep.
So the 3080 relative to the 2080 Ti doesn't scale from, say, 720p up to 4K. So the 2080 Ti won't scale as well as the resolution goes up. So it'll sort of do that, and the 3080 will do that.
Yep.
So it scales much more aggressively because you're able to put all those extra cores to work when you get higher resolutions. We've explained exactly why that is in the scaling video that we're talking about here and the review. So if you want to learn more about those, then watch those. I won't go over it all again here. That has nothing to do with VRAM capacity or even bandwidth. So that is simply, as I said, the cores being able to... So the more cores you get, the harder it is to keep them all busy with work. You end up with idle cores when you get really core-heavy GPUs. So it's not even necessarily that it's an architectural limitation, it's the configuration of that architecture. So the 3070, for example, scales very similar to the 2080 Ti. So it scales, I would say, consistently from 1080p to 1440p to 4K, whereas the 3080 is weak at 1080p, not too bad at 1440p, it's better, and then very strong at 4K. Now, the RDNA 2 GPUs that have 16 gigabytes of VRAM but slightly less memory bandwidth, but again, we won't go into that because it's not a factor here, they scale more traditionally, more as you would expect. So the 6800 XT scales in line with the 3070, for example, across those three resolutions. So NVIDIA's upcoming bar implementation, that won't really change any of that.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of... it sounds like there's a bit of confusion in this question, and this has come up in a couple of questions I've seen that we haven't got time to answer in this one. But it sounds like some people believe that something like smart access memory or bar doing, this sort of thing where the CPU can access the GPU's memory means that the GPU can get away with lower VRAM.
Right.
But that's not the case because it's not the GPU accessing system memory, it's the CPU accessing your GPU memory. So the GPU still needs the same amount of memory as always, it's just that the CPU has a more optimal path to accessing game assets. Mm-hmm. So it can, just as it says in the name, access the memory
more intelligently
of the GPU. So unfortunately on a card like a 3080 or specifically a 3070 that only has 8 gigabytes, enabling bar isn't going to mean that that's a 10 or 12 gigabyte card suddenly because it can't do the reverse of accessing system memory. At least that's my understanding, is that it can't go the other way. So it does help with the CPU side of things, but doesn't help as much on the VRAM type of things. So when this question says NVIDIA's upcoming bar implementation could work in a similar way to having more memory, I don't think that's the case.
No, it's not. And again, the 20 gigabyte card won't scale any differently to the 10 gigabyte card. All that will ensure is when you go over 10 gigabytes of VRAM, you won't see a performance hit.
Yeah, that's right. And there's definitely a lot of confusion about the architectural differences because, again, as we talked about before, some people think it's a CPU bottleneck or memory bandwidth or whatever that's causing these performance differences between 1080p and 4K.
Yep. It's exactly what we used to see with the GCN computer architecture.
It's a different architecture than what we've seen before with the double FP32 processing. So in some ways, I guess you could say, 1080p is bottlenecked architecturally, but it's also kind of the reverse where it's not necessarily bottlenecked at 1080p. 1080p might be performing as expected. It's just that it's amazing at 4K in comparison, where it can really start pumping up into those FP32.
Yeah, it scales better. It's bottlenecked in the sense that
it's bottlenecked relative to 4K. It's bottlenecked at 1080p.
Yeah,
but relative to 1080p, it's amazing at 4K.
Yeah, it's not as efficient as it could be. It's not utilized as well as it could be.
Yes, it sees less utilization at lower resolutions.
So it doesn't necessarily mean the GPU utilization thing at the top will change.
It's confusing. It's a lot of things going on.
We'll move on to the next one. All right, next question here. Why would AMD/NVIDIA spend thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars in designing and manufacturing reference GPUs, only to have a handful of them sold for one batch? Why don't they instead just let AIBs sell the GPUs? This may increase the available stock during launch, give time for AIBs to design, ship enough cards to meet demand. Yeah, look, AMD, for example, they create a reference card. So theirs isn't a Founders Edition. The AMD reference card is a reference card. It's a point of reference for the AIBs to build on. So they expect that their cards will be as good as this or better in terms of PCB design, cooling, the whole lot. Nvidia does the same thing. They do a reference card, but they don't sell it. So they make an Nvidia reference card like what AMD does, but you don't see that from Nvidia. Then they go and make their own GPUs, which are the Founders Edition versions, which do compete with AIBs. Why they decided to do that or found a need to do that, I'm sure we've talked about it previously.
Yeah, we talked about how like they need a reference that is like a blower card style design for like OEMs and that sort of thing, so they can go and very cheaply make a reference product that requires very little design and engineering work. But at the same time, as we've talked about, you can't sell a blower card anymore because there's all sorts of issues with the reviews would trash thermals and noise performance. So they basically have designed this reference, well, it's not a reference card, the Founders Edition card, so that they can have the best of both worlds. So have a reference design for OEM partners that need one, and then have a Founders Edition card that is effectively like the stock card that isn't going to run like crap. They can show it to reviewers, get good positive feedback on the card, and then sell it for, you know, a limited time or whatever the situation is.
Yeah, so I don't know what AMD is doing there, whether they've got an OEM only card that we haven't seen.
Yeah, who knows?
They've designed maybe it's the same PCB with a blower cooler. I'm not sure on that one. But anyway, we'll move on. All right, a bit of a long one here, so bear with me. With the introduction of the 6800 XT and RTX 3080 series of GPUs, GPU-bound gaming will undoubtedly increase in popularity. Prices on 1440p and 4K monitors seem to be falling as well. My question is, how does gaming at GPU-bound resolutions like 1440p or 4K influence the number of cores and threads left available to a system for other tasks? For example, at 4K, might a 6-core 6-thread or 8-core 8-thread CPU suffice, whereas a 6-core 12-thread or 8-core 16-thread CPU were previously necessary? If fewer cores may be needed in future, this would seem to contradict the predictions made by some core mongers that unless you have a 12-core CPU, you don't have 3 or 4 years for your gaming PC. Lastly, doesn't being GPU bound increase the importance of having the faster gaming CPU? Okay, this is kind of a confusing question. Where do I even begin with this? A lot of like sort of strange assumptions. Basically, so with the introduction of the 6800 XT and the RTX 3080, they're really fast GPUs, much faster than the previous generation parts. So that wouldn't increase the likelihood of GPU-bound gaming. It would actually increase the likelihood of CPU-bound gaming.
Yep.
So that would do the opposite to what the start of this question is.
Unless you're moving up to, like, you're thinking, oh, now I can game at an even higher resolution, but then you have to have lower frame rates, so...
Yeah, then it's sort of a consistency there. But at 1440p, with either of those GPUs, you still need a pretty good CPU. Like, for example, with, like, any Zen part, or Zen... Not so much Zen Plus, maybe... Yeah, any Zen or Zen Plus part, there will definitely be some kind of limitation there in most games at 1440p. 4K, look, when you're gaming at 4K, you are mostly GPU bound, even with the latest GPUs using like CPUs from 3-4 years ago. And then I guess the second part, the misconception there is again people's insistence on focusing on core count. I think I really did quite a good explanation of this with the Ryzen 5 5600X review. So I would say 6-core 6-threaded CPUs of any architecture are probably teetering on the edge of being insufficient and kind of unrealistic anyway to be paired with a $700 US plus GPU. We're talking about rather really not even mid-range, low-end CPUs at this point. And then as for, like, you don't need a 12-core CPU. And to say that if you don't have a 12-core CPU, gaming system's not going to last 3 to 4 years, well, yeah, that's kind of...
Yeah, I talked many times before about, it's not about the cores, it's about what cores are we talking about?
It's about CPU performance. And again, even when I made that argument in the 5600X review, people were like, oh, but it is about cores because some games needed a quad core or wouldn't run on a quad core anymore. And it's like, yeah, because there was no quad core with that level of CPU performance. So it's kind of like, it's all about CPU level of performance. Forget about core count, because you can get a Xeon CPU with 12 cores that's going to run games like garbage because it's clocked at 3 gigahertz or something like that. So it's really about CPU performance and having a good balance of single core and multi-core performance. But basically, something like a 5600X is going to game very well for at least the next couple of years. So spending $100 more, twice as much money to get the same architecture with, 2 more cores or 4 more cores or twice as many cores is a bit silly, because in 2 years' time, you'll be able to buy the equivalent of a 5600X again, but with much more performance.
That's right.
So it's kind of like going, I'm going to buy a Ryzen. So rewind a couple of years. I'm trying to give an example that we can, we've already seen play out. So it's like saying, I'm going to buy a Ryzen 7 1700 because it's got 8 cores, 16 thread, and I'll never need to upgrade it for ages. And while somewhat true, because that CPU still certainly works quite well today, if you had have just bought a 1600, a Ryzen 5 1600, and saved $120 or $130 or whatever it was, and then put that money towards, say we get a Ryzen 5 5600 for 200, let's say, what was it, $220?
Yep.
So years later, the $100 you saved, all you need to do is come up with another $100, and you get a CPU that will absolutely murder a Ryzen 7 1700 in games. So you see why it's a bit silly to buy much more than you need. It's good to get a little bit more, like don't buy a Core i5 7600K, buy a Ryzen 5 1600 instead, because it's quite clear one's on a knife edge where one has quite a bit more life in it. So it's about buying the one that has obviously more life in it, but then not going too far in that direction and getting a card that just has way more performance than you need.
It's all about assessing what amount of performance do games need now. I'm not talking cores or frequency or whatever. It's just, what is the performance level that games require now? Mm-hmm. How much do you see games increasing that in the future? Mm-hmm. And then buying a CPU that has that level of performance. So yeah, it's not about necessarily buying your 8-core, 16 or 6-core CPUs. It's about the level of performance, and we know today that the 6-core CPU is more than sufficient.
Yep.
More than sufficient for today's games, because its overall level of performance is better. And it's like, I guess like saying, like, would you buy a Ryzen 7 1700 over a Ryzen 5 5600X, despite the 1700 having 2 more cores? It's like the 5600X gives you significantly more.
Talking over 50% performance boost.
Yeah, it's just got more performance than it has on offer.
Yeah, and this is the point I made with the 5600X review. There will be no point in time ever that the Ryzen 7 1700 gets anywhere near the performance of the Ryzen 5 5600X. Doesn't matter if games, I hate saying this, but it doesn't matter if games need 24 cores. Doesn't matter. The 5600X will always destroy the Ryzen 7 1700 in games, always. And I made this argument with the people were saying the Ryzen 7 2700X is a better buy for gaming than the Core i7 8700K because it has 2 more cores. And then I dedicated a whole video to testing a whole heap of scenarios, and it turns out no, there's basically no point in time where a 2700X will beat an 8700K in games. Because of the advantages, the per-core advantages the 8700K has. And just lastly, the kind of issue I have with these questions, the way these ones are always framed, in a way doesn't seem like a real scenario. So I don't mean to attack Felix here at all.
Flex,
sorry. How many people, again, I've said this already, but how many people are spending $700 US on a graphics card, and they're like, do I spend $200 or $300 on my CPU? I feel like most people that are buying a really high-end premium flagship graphics card will probably just get the $300 CPU.
Yep.
So this conversation becomes more realistic when we're talking about, do you need a 6-core or an 8-core CPU when you're in that mid-range?
Yeah, like if
So-
you're buying a new $400 GPU, then it makes a lot of sense to talk about
Yeah.
5600X versus 5800X.
That's right. So if you've got high-end graphics card money, you should be buying. I mean, again, I'm not saying you should buy a 5900X, a 12-core Ryzen CPU, because you're buying a high-end GPU. I'm just saying it might make more sense to go for an 8-core CPU there rather than a 6-core CPU,
depending on your use case.
depending on the use case and all that kind of stuff. But it just seems like a less realistic scenario there. Whereas if you're like umming and ahhing about, do I get a Ryzen a Radeon 5700 or maybe a 2070 Super, which one of those two do I get? Do I spend $300 or spend a bit more? And if you're tossing up the budget there, then I think there it makes sense to save $100 on the CPU and spend maybe $100 more on the GPU. Again, it depends on the situation.
Yeah.
But anyway, we probably spent enough time on
It's
this one.
just the usual thing of games are not locked to cores.
Yeah.
Games are not locked to cores. They just require a certain level of performance. And if you meet that requirement, you're all good to go. So,
It's really that simple.
yeah. All right, next question should be a fairly easy one for us to answer, much more so than perhaps the last question. Which automation tools do you use to facilitate benchmarking and video creation? Keystroke recording, auto-generating blue bars. It can't be all manual labor, can it? Well, hate to break it to you, but yes, it can.
Yeah, it's all manual labor, 100%. So we always get people telling us we're crazy and we should automate our benchmark suite. There's so many reasons why we don't do that. Partly because a large portion of the games can't be automated. And then the ones that can be, it's like they're really easy to run anyway. So the stuff that you can automate is already really easy to benchmark. And while there can be a little bit of time saved there, we have come across other media outlets who do automate their benchmarks. And again, this isn't we're not attacking them or trying to put them down, but they do seem to make a lot more mistakes, because when you run that automated benchmark and you walk away from it and you just trust that the data you've got is accurate and you put that in your graphs, just much more margin for error there than I would like. And we've seen it happen time and time again where, they've changed a setting in the game, or that doesn't quite do what I thought it does anymore. Or
Yeah, especially if you're relying on something like keystroke recording, for example, to test a game without a built-in benchmark. It's like testing, let's say Watch Dogs, for example, which does have a built-in benchmark. But if you were testing that in the open world, what if your benchmark run just hits a wall or hits a car or an NPC or something, and the benchmark run fails, but it still records the data?
Yeah, it would.
And you're not there to know what's happening.
That's right.
So you might get, bad data. And oftentimes you're not going to notice that bad data until other reviews come out, because it is possible that a game might be a lot faster on one GPU than another, but you just don't know until other people have tested that game and it turns out, oh, hang on, something went wrong there. So if you're monitoring the testing process yourself, it does make it much more likely that what you're seeing is accurate from that sense. Unless you have, and again, it's like the amount of time and effort it would take to develop the automation tools that would be accurate enough.
And then maintain it.
And make sure, you have to have like a dedicated automation engineer on your team.
You would.
To make sure that the benchmark is running with all the latest game updates. It's not breaking.
And then
it's
we're
just,
constantly looking at other ways. Like if someone's like, this game, if you play on for another 2 hours, there's a much more demanding scene that's better for testing CPUs. And often we will test games differently for CPUs and GPUs, so then you need a CPU automation tool and then a GPU. It's not worth it. And we're constantly picking up new games and dropping games. Like generally the tech media outlets that you find using automation, they're primarily testing canned benchmarks, and they're using the same old games over and over again. They're not often constantly updating. So we're constantly updating our games list and adding new games and dropping older ones or less popular ones or whatever it may be. And then as for the graph creation, the blue bar graphs, that's all done in Excel. Very tedious, very painful to get them all perfect, and that's a nightmare, that one.
Well, not if you build an automation tool.
Well, Tim does have an automation tool for that.
My graphs for laptop content and monitor content are auto-generated. So a lot of that stuff. So I guess it's different because when you test stuff, you make like a new Excel spreadsheet for all of the reviews that you do. With
Different
all the data
formats, different templates.
Yeah, that's right. So I use, basically Excel has like for my laptop testing, for example, I have all the benchmarks in there for all the laptops in a big table. So I just go through and enter the numbers in there, and then that auto populates the graphs in the sort of
Do you still have to copy and paste the graphs out, or does it auto convert them to like
into pictures? No, the only thing I have to do is copy the graphs out.
Yes, that's still tons of work.
Maybe change the ranges. Oh, it's much less work than creating a new graph every single time.
Oh, I don't create a new graph every time. I create one graph as a template and then copy the data into those fields.
Oh yeah.
So there's only one graph that spawns all the other graphs, but I am constantly changing the format. Like sometimes it'll have, different things in the graph. Like I might have 1080p, 1440p, and 4K.
Oh, right. So, yeah, I set that up. So I just have, my spreadsheet might have like 4 different graph formats for the same data. So I can just choose whichever format I want.
Yeah.
And then
I've got that on different pages, but it just basically, it's as automated as much as it can be on that front, but I'm constantly changing things and tweaking it. But yeah, I have a whole different heap of templates that I copy data into. But when you've got 40 graphs and you copy and paste them out into Photoshop, that's still a ton of work.
Yeah, I guess the one thing I could probably do is make a macro to explore all the graphs at once. It's probably the next step on that, but I'm not that great at making macros, so I probably won't bother.
Yeah, I mean...
But you go into Photoshop and you highlight all the ones individually in Photoshop, don't you?
The bars to change the color. Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that can be done in Excel.
That's fun. But then when they bars move, it doesn't move with them. All right. Would you, Tim, give up your proprietary monitor sync technology, so G-Sync, FreeSync, in favor of a slightly superior graphics card from the other team? For instance, would you give up G-Sync on your monitor and go with a better performing AMD card?
Well, luckily, if you've bought into the ecosystem in the last couple of years, this isn't as much of an issue anymore because all modern G-Sync and FreeSync monitors work with both brands, including ones with the G-Sync module from, it's either like early or mid 2019. I'm not 100% sure on the dates on that one, but certainly mod monitors, not an issue. So I guess if you're talking, you already have like a G-Sync monitor, to me, I wouldn't give it up. And I think it would require a substantially better product because FreeSync or G-Sync is significant enough of a feature advantage that, you really don't want to be turning it off. So you kind of like, you might be improving your overall performance, but you're kind of going backwards on having variable refresh rates. So I wouldn't be giving that up when the products are very similar. And I think for this generation, the products are similar enough that if you're kind of locked into the G-Sync ecosystem, that AMD isn't providing enough of an incentive to switch over. It would have to be, like I said, substantially better in one way or another. It's unfortunate for people who have bought into the G-Sync ecosystem and are now kind of stuck with Nvidia, but hopefully your next monitor upgrade, this situation will be totally resolved and you won't have to bother about lock-in anymore, which is great. Steve, is there a particular reason why GPUs are always facing down with fans facing towards the bottom of the case? Is there a reason for this, or is it just convention?
So does he mean why is the fans not on the other side of the
Yeah, I
card?
think why are the fans on this side as opposed to on like the top side where the backplate normally is?
So like how the ATX form factor works.
Yeah.
Because it's an ATX form factor and that's how it works. Basically, if you change... if I'm understanding this correctly, if you would have to put the GPU and everything on the other side of the PCB,
Yep.
And then the cooler would sit on top, and then the fans would blow down, and then the entire form factor would be broken and nothing would fit in the case because you wouldn't be able to fit your CPU or your memory or anything because the graphics card cooler would be in the way, and it would offer absolutely no performance benefit whatsoever because natural convection isn't a thing when you actually have active fans forcing air. It doesn't become... it's negligible at that point. I thought the question was, why do the fans blow the air into the heatsink? Why don't they pull it? So push-pull thing. No.
I think it's more why are they on that side of the card as opposed to on the other side?
Oh,
as in why are they facing towards the bottom of the case?
Because that's where all the expansion stuff is basically. It's how
that's basically right.
It's how the form factor is designed.
Yeah, and for airflow reasons, it probably makes a little bit more sense to try and draw air from that bottom section where there's going to be less hot components.
Yeah, you'd be blasting hundreds of watts of heat over your VRM heat sinks and stuff with it on the other side.
Well, if you're sucking from the top as well, you're sucking air from the hotter CPU zone where you've got your memory, your VRMs, and potentially your air CPU cooler.
Everything's heating everything up.
So instead of drawing air from the front through and under and just up into the GPU, you're sucking air from across, but then potentially from all that central zone up the top, and that whole
basically,
bottom area is getting
A full ATX case would have the thermal dynamics of a mini ITX system.
Yeah, that's right. You'd be ignoring a whole potential thermal zone at the bottom for airflow. And of course, that will depend on your case setup and fans and everything. But in your typical ATX form factor, what it's built for, it just makes a lot more sense to have it the other way around. Even, that's not even considering, as you said, the space issues if you can't really do it the other way anyway.
It breaks everything.
Yeah, it breaks everything.
Stop making suggestions. How much would an RX 5700 XT have to drop in price to make it worth to buy now that Big Navi has been revealed? Considering upgrading from an RX 580, and what would be willing to spend, roughly $400. Well, $400 is the MSRP, so probably don't get one for $400 now. But I think in terms of cost per frame, the 5700 XT still stacks up quite well. Obviously, that's relative to higher end cards, which generally charge a premium. So I think a 5700 XT would want to be down around $300.
Yeah, I'd say a tier lower.
Than 300?
No, as in it's in the $400 tier.
Yeah.
But I'd say more in the 2060 tier.
Because we saw 5700s going on sale like last year for $300.
Yeah, that's right. So I mean, I guess the way to think of it is,
I think $300 is the answer.
Is, I guess, like, we'd be expecting, say, the tier below a 3070, so like a 3060 Ti, for example, or 3060, to be around the mark of a 2080. So that was a $700 GPU. It's probably going to be like $400 at a guess. So that's currently in this tier. So that would be, definitely can't charge $400. So then you'd be moving like your 2070 and 2070 Supers down the next slot, which would be, and the 5700 XT is right around that mark. So you'd be moving from that $400 or $500 down to about $300 where the 2060 is. So yeah, I think $250 to $300 is probably where those want those cards to be, and then you'd want your entry level GPUs to be 2060 performance.
Obviously, right now either of those prices is wishful thinking. I think $250 is probably wishful thinking, period. But I think once we get good availability, certainly once the new $400-ish cards come in for this generation, then $300 would be a reasonable price for that part. All right, that is going to do it for this month's Q&A. So my voice mostly held out. Just had some water, and that's helped quite a bit. But yeah, great questions as usual. Crazy kind of month.
Oh, it's been insane. The last couple of months, since September, it's been very, very busy.
It actually has been, I haven't slept too much since the RTX 3080 release, but it's been a whole heap of fun, and we've got more to go.
Yep.
So I'll try and get sleep where I can, but yeah, it's been a lot of fun, and you guys seem to appreciate the content and have been enjoying it, so that's also good and makes it all worthwhile. And Tim's been doing some work as well. You've got some there's a whole collection of monitors over there, so you must be working on something.
Oh, my office at the moment in terms of monitors is like,
I couldn't get in here.
Yeah, it's pretty hectic with all the stuff.
Well, like I said, it's been about 10 months, I think, 9 or 10 months since I was last here.
Yep.
And my place is the same, but damn,
just so much stuff is coming in.
Yeah, I didn't realize you had so many monitors here. They're just sort of stacked up everywhere.
I've got to put them somewhere.
Yeah, the studio is now inside monitor boxes. We're filming in a monitor floor.
It's crazy.
But anyway, if you would like to get access to our monthly live streams, we just did the Patreon/Floatplane live stream today. We'll be doing one again next month. There's behind the scenes videos, our exclusive Discord chat for Harbour Unboxed community members, all that stuff. So if you're interested, the links for that will be in the video description. Again, that is Patreon and Floatplane, so check those out if you're interested. If not, perfectly fine. We do appreciate you just watching this video anyway. Cool. That also helps us out. So yeah, I'm your host, Steve.
I'm your host, Tim.
See you next time.